Good morning to you all. Let's touch on the story of Elisha, the children, and the birds. Few stories in the Bible generate as much confusion, controversy, and debate as the story of Elisha, the children, and the birds. For many people, the story seems straightforward. A group of children make fun of a prophet. The prophet responds. Bears appear. And the conclusion many people reach is this story makes no sense. This is cruel. Why would God do something like this? As a result, the passage is often used as an example of why some people struggle with the Bible altogether. But what if the problem is not the story itself? What if the problem is that we are reading a symbolic text as though it were merely a newspaper report? One of the challenges with scripture is that we often recognize symbolism in some passages while ignoring it in others. When Jesus says, I am the door, we understand that he is not literally made of wood. When scripture speaks about God being a rock, a fortress, or a shepherd, we instinctively recognize symbolic language. Yet, when we come to difficult passages, many people suddenly abandon symbolism altogether and assume every detail must be read only at the surface level. But what if this story is filled with symbols? What if Bethel means something? What if the city means something? What if the children represent something? What if the birds represent something? What if the journey itself is part of the message? Because the biblical writers often communicate through patterns, images, symbols, and archetypes that reveal deeper truths about consciousness, transformation, and the human experience. And when we begin looking beneath the surface, this story becomes far more relevant than most people realize. Suddenly, it is no longer a story about a bald prophet and two bears. It becomes a story about awakening, resistance to truth, mockery, ego, the refusal to receive wisdom, and the consequences that emerge when consciousness continually rejects correction. So before we decide what this story means, let's slow down. Let's examine the symbols. Let's follow the journey. And let's see whether this passage is actually saying what most people assume it says. Because sometimes the most misunderstood stories in scripture become the most illuminating once we learn how to read them. So let's begin. 2 Kings 2 verse 23. And he went up from thence unto Bethel. And as he was going up by the way, there came forth little children out of the city, and mocked him, and said unto him, Go up, thou bald head, go up, thou bald head. This is one of the most misunderstood stories in Scripture, because people often focus on the insult and completely miss the symbolism. But before we even discuss the mockery, let's identify the symbols. Elisha represents the new mantle, the new awareness, the continuation of truth after Elijah's departure. A higher level of understanding has emerged. Next is Bethel. Bethel means house of God. Throughout Scripture, a house often symbolizes a state of consciousness. So Bethel represents divine awareness, alignment with truth, the inner dwelling place of God. Next is going up. Elisha is going up. This symbolizes elevation, growth, awakening, expansion of consciousness, and movement toward greater understanding. The way. The way represents the journey itself, the process of transformation, the path between where you are and where you are becoming. The city. The city symbolizes a collective mindset, a belief system, a culture, an organized structure of thought. Next, the children. Children often represent expressions, manifestations, what comes out of something. Just as children are the offspring of parents, these children are the offspring of the city, the products of the mindset, the products of the culture, the products of the belief system. Next, the mockery. The mockery symbolizes contempt for truth, dismissal of wisdom, resistance to correction, immature consciousness, refusing to learn. The bald head. Hair often symbolizes outward glory, appearance, status, external identity. The bald head symbolizes the stripping away of external prestige. The city is attacking appearance rather than engaging substance. Now let's read the verse again. Slowly. Elisha, new awareness, is moving upward, awakening toward Bethel, the house of God. By the way, the path of transformation. As this happens, children, the product of the old mindset, come out of the city, the existing belief system, and mock him. The question becomes why? Because this is what often happens whenever consciousness begins to grow. Relatable example: someone tells the truth, not to attack, not to control, not to shame, but because they genuinely see something. Instead of examining the truth, the response becomes, "Who are you to tell me that? Don't you know who I am? I have my master's degree. I have my PhD. I am older than you. I've been doing this longer than you've been alive. I pay your bills. I clothe you. I raised you. How dare you advise me?" Notice what happened. The discussion moved away from "is it true?" and shifted toward "who are you?" The messenger became the issue. The message disappeared. Just like Jesus was told, "Is this not the carpenter's son?" The messenger became the issue. The children revealed the city. This is the genius of the symbolism. The children reveal what kind of city produced them. If the city were producing wisdom, we might hear, "Explain further. Help me understand. Could I be mistaken?" Instead, the city produces mockery, arrogance, contempt, and status consciousness. The children reveal the culture. Family example: a grown child notices something unhealthy in the family, perhaps manipulation, emotional abuse, favoritism, addiction, or financial irresponsibility. The child respectfully points it out. Instead of considering the concern, the parent responds, "I'm the parent. You are the child. Who do you think you are? I fed you. I clothed you. I sacrificed for you." The truth is never examined. The messenger is attacked. The children have come out of the city. Religious example: this happens constantly in spiritual spaces. Someone asks a sincere question, challenges a tradition, offers a different perspective. Instead of addressing the point, people respond, "What seminary did you attend? How many churches have you led? Who ordained you? What are your credentials?" Again, the messenger becomes the focus. The message disappears. "Go up, thou bald head." The phrase becomes symbolic. The city is essentially saying, "We don't respect you. We don't want what you are bringing. Take your message somewhere else. Who do you think you are?" This is often the first response of ego when it encounters truth. The inner meaning. Within consciousness, these children represent immature thought patterns. The voices that say, I already know. Nobody can teach me. I am too educated to learn. I am too experienced to be corrected. I am too important to listen. Those voices emerge whenever truth challenges identity. This pattern appears throughout scripture. The messenger is mocked before the message is considered. Truth is dismissed before it is examined. Wisdom is rejected because it arrived from an unexpected source. The verse is saying, as consciousness begins ascending toward greater awareness, the old mindset often responds with mockery, arrogance, and status consciousness. Instead of examining truth, it attacks the messenger because ego would rather defend its position than be transformed. The deepest question this verse asks is, when truth comes to you, do you examine the message? Or do you first examine the status of the messenger? Verse 24, and he turned back and looked on them and cursed them in the name of the Lord. And there came forth 2 she-bears out of the wood, and tare 42 children of them. This is the verse that causes many people to stop reading. Because if read literally and superficially, it appears to say, children mocked a prophet. The prophet got angry. God sent bears to kill them. And many people understandably ask, how is that justice? How is that compassion? How is that wisdom? So as always, let's slow down and examine the symbols. Elisha turning back. Turning back symbolizes stopping, looking again, bringing awareness to something, confronting what has emerged. Elisha does not continue walking. He turns and faces the issue. Looking on them. To look upon something symbolically means to become conscious of it, to bring it into awareness, to see it clearly. Throughout scripture, transformation often begins when something hidden is finally seen. Next, cursing in the name of the Lord. This is where many people immediately think Elisha became angry and cursed them. But let's examine the symbolism. The Lord often represents truth, reality, higher awareness, or divine order. A curse often symbolizes the consequences of misalignment becoming visible. In other words, truth exposes what a pattern eventually produces. Modern example. Suppose someone continually lives with arrogance, mocks wisdom, rejects correction, despises accountability. Eventually, life begins exposing the consequences. They experience broken relationships, failed opportunities, isolation, and conflict. The curse is not necessarily God becoming angry. It is the inevitable outcome of the pattern. The two she-bears. Now we arrive at the most important symbol. Why she-bears? This is another fascinating detail most people overlook. The text does not simply say bears. It specifically says she-bears. Now, within the symbolic framework we've been using throughout scripture, this becomes very interesting. Throughout many of our teachings, man symbolizes conscious awareness. Woman symbolizes the soul, the emotional realm, the receptive realm. Children symbolize manifestations or expressions. Cities symbolize systems of thought. So we might reasonably ask, why does the story specify female bears? Why not male bears? Why make the distinction at all? Because in symbolic language, details often matter. One possible reading is that the consequences emerge through the emotional realm. Remember what the children have been expressing: mockery, arrogance, contempt, pride, and resistance to truth. Many people assume these are purely intellectual issues, but eventually they become emotional realities. A person who continually rejects correction often develops bitterness, resentment, offense, isolation, loneliness, and emotional hardness. The soul eventually begins experiencing the consequences of the mindset. The she-bears emerge from the woods. And notice where they come from: the woods, the hidden place, the unconscious, the place where things grow unseen. That is often how emotional consequences work. People think nothing is happening. Years pass. The arrogance remains. The contempt remains. The unwillingness to listen remains. Then one day, the marriage collapses. The friendships disappear. The children stop calling. The loneliness becomes overwhelming. The bears were growing in the woods all along. The consequences were developing beneath the surface. There's another layer as well. A mother bear is known for being fiercely protective, powerful, relentless, protective of what is valuable. In that sense, the she bears can symbolize reality itself, protecting truth from continual mockery and contempt, not through revenge, but through consequence. The city produced children of mockery. The soul eventually produced bears of consequence. The immature mind mocked wisdom. The emotional realm eventually felt the results. And suddenly, the story becomes less about animals and more about what happens when arrogance repeatedly refuses correction. Because one of the greatest truths in life is this: what we continually sow in consciousness eventually returns through the emotional realm. Sooner or later, the soul feels what the ego refuses to learn. Why two bears? The number two often symbolizes witness, confirmation, duality, cause and effect. The consequences are now being witnessed. The pattern is now revealing itself. What are the bears really doing? Notice the progression: mockery, arrogance, contempt, resistance to truth. Eventually, something emerges from the unconscious and tears the system apart. Family example: a parent refuses correction for years. Children point out unhealthy patterns. Friends point out unhealthy patterns. Reality points out unhealthy patterns. The response is always, "Who are you to tell me anything?" Eventually, the marriage collapses. Relationships break. Children become distant. The bears arrive. Not because God hates the person, but because reality eventually reveals the consequences of the pattern. Imagine someone constantly saying, "I have my doctorates. I have my master's. I'm older than you. I feed you. Who are you to advise me?" They dismiss every voice because of status, because of ego, because of position. Eventually, life itself becomes the teacher. The bears arrive, perhaps in the form of a divorce, a business collapsing, and strange children, broken relationships. The consequences become impossible to ignore. 40 and 2 children. Throughout scripture, the number 42 is often connected to periods of testing, transition, and the exposure of systems. Rather than focusing on arithmetic, the symbolic point is the products of the city are being affected. Remember, the children came from the city. They were manifestations of the city's mindset. Now the consequences affects the manifestations. In other words, a dysfunctional mindset eventually damages what it produces. Modern example. Suppose a culture teaches status is everything. Credentials are everything. Never admit you are wrong. Never listen to people beneath you. What kind of children does that city produce? Arrogant ones, defensive ones, unteachable ones. Eventually, reality begins tearing that system apart. The bears arrive. Christ consciousness and reality. One of the deepest truths in scripture is this: truth does not need revenge. Reality itself teaches. You can ignore wisdom, mock wisdom, dismiss wisdom, but eventually, reality becomes the instructor. And reality is often a much harsher teacher than humility. The inner meaning. Within consciousness, these children represent immature thought patterns. The bears represent powerful consequences emerging from the unconscious. When immature thinking continually mocks truth, reality eventually confronts it. The very patterns that were protected begin tearing the system apart. The verse is saying, when consciousness continually rejects truth, mocks wisdom, and refuses correction, hidden consequences eventually emerge and begin dismantling the immature patterns that produce the resistance. Because the story is not really about bears. The story is about what happens when arrogance refuses to learn. The city mocked wisdom. The children expressed the city's mindset, and eventually, reality itself became the teacher. The question the verse leaves us with: would you rather learn from humility or learn from the bears? Verse 25. And he went from thence to Mount Carmel, and from thence he returned to Samaria. At first glance, this verse seems insignificant. The bears appear, the confrontation ends, and then we are simply told where Elisha went next. But in symbolic scripture, journeys matter, locations matter, movements matter. The verse is actually showing us what happens after immature resistance has been exposed and confronted. As we've seen throughout the story, Elisha represents awakened awareness, the new mantle, higher consciousness, truth continuing after Elijah. Mount Carmel is one of the most important locations in the prophetic tradition. It is strongly associated with Elijah's confrontation with the prophets of Baal. Symbolically, Carmel represents a place of testing, a place where truth and illusion are separated. a place where competing voices are exposed. Mountains often represent elevated consciousness, higher perception, greater awareness. So Mount Carmel becomes the elevation where falsehood is exposed and truth is revealed. Next is Samaria. Samaria often represents the collective mind, the broader society, organized systems, or communal consciousness. In many prophetic narratives, Samaria symbolizes a larger structure that requires awakening. The progression is beautiful. Let's look at the journey. It starts as Bethel, house of God. Awakening begins. The children, immature patterns emerge. Resistance appears. Mockery appears. The birds, consequences expose the immaturity. Reality confronts the illusion. Mount Carmel, truth becomes established. Discernment becomes clearer. The illusion is separated from reality. Samaria, now awakened consciousness, returns to engage the larger system. This progression is incredibly important. Modern example. Suppose someone begins questioning unhealthy beliefs. At first, friends mock them. Family resists them. Colleagues dismiss them. The children of the city appear. Then life exposes the limitations of the old mindset. The birds arrive. Reality begins teaching lessons. Eventually, clarity emerges. Discernment deepens. Truth becomes established. That's Mount Carmel. Then the person returns to everyday life, work, family, community, society. That's Samaria. Why Elisha doesn't stay at Carmel? This is a powerful lesson. Many people experience awakening and want to remain on the mountain forever. They want endless study, endless reflection, endless isolation. But notice what Elisha does. He returns. Because awakening is not merely about escaping the world. It is about engaging the world differently. This mirrors Moses on the mountain. Moses ascends the mountain. The mountain symbolizes elevated consciousness, higher awareness, communion with the divine, revelation. Then Moses descends. And what does he find? The golden calf. A people who have turned away from the truth they have just received. A collective consciousness that has fallen back into old patterns. Notice the sequence. Mountain to revelation to descent to confrontation with idolatry. Let's look at Elisha and Carmel. Elisha moves toward Carmel. Carmel is also associated with elevated awareness, discernment, the exposure of falsehood, the place where Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal. Then Elisha leaves Carmel and returns to Samaria, a symbol of collective consciousness that requires correction, a system still wrestling with truth and illusion. Again, the pattern is mountain to discernment, to descent, to engagement with society. The pattern repeats with Jesus. This is why these stories feel familiar. Jesus ascends mountains repeatedly. He prays. He receives clarity. He is transfigured. Then he comes back down. And what does he find? Arguments, confusion, fear, sickness, division. The mountain is never the destination. The mountain prepares you for the valley. Awakening is not escapism. Many people want to stay on the mountain, stay in meditation, stay in study, stay in revelation, stay in spiritual experiences. But scripture repeatedly shows the opposite movement. Moses comes down. Elijah comes down. Elisha comes down. Jesus comes down. Even Noah comes down from Mount Ararat. Because the purpose of higher awareness is not to escape humanity. It is to serve humanity. The mountain represents revelation. The city represents application. Anyone can feel spiritual on the mountain. The real test is what happens when you return to the city. That's exactly what Moses faces with the golden calf. And it's exactly what Elisha faces after Carmel. Both return from elevated awareness and encounter the state of consciousness below. The mountain reveals truth. The city reveals whether that truth has been integrated. And throughout scripture, the journey is never city to mountain to stay there. It's always city to mountain to return. Because wisdom that never returns to serve others remains incomplete. When read symbolically, this passage is not a story about a prophet being insulted because he was bald. It is a story about what happens when truth challenges established systems. The city represents collective conditioning. The children represent immature expressions of that conditioning. The mockery represents contempt for wisdom. The birds represent consequences emerging from hidden places. Mount Carmel represents discernment. And Samaria represents the world we must eventually return to. The verse is saying, when consciousness begins ascending toward truth, immature patterns often respond with ridicule and resistance. But if those patterns continually reject correction, reality itself becomes the teacher. Through that process, discernment is born, and awakened awareness returns to life with greater wisdom. And perhaps the deepest lesson of the entire story is this: the problem was never the bald head. The problem was the refusal to listen. Because growth becomes possible, The moment we stop asking, who are you to tell me? And begin asking, could there be truth in what is being said? This passage ultimately asks a question every seeker must answer. When truth comes from an unexpected source, like a child, a stranger, a subordinate, a critic, someone younger than you, someone less educated than you, someone with less status than you, will you mock the messenger or will you examine the message? Because wisdom often arises from places ego least expects. And the difference between the city and the mountain is often the difference between defending what you already believe and being willing to learn something new. So that's what the chapter is about. So we see, God never killed, oh my goodness. Scripture tells us God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. So why would God turn around and kill children? Do you see what literalism does? It paints a different picture of God, even though the clues are everywhere. If God is light, if Jesus said, let the children come to me, why would Elisha turn around and curse them, and then God will send bears? Like, come on. Come on. The clues are everywhere. We need to slow down and connect the patterns. Scripture does not contradict itself. It doesn't. If God is life itself, why would God turn around and destroy life? It doesn't add up. So this brings us to the end of the chapter. I will see you in the next teaching.